although I'm mostly a commercial law guy, I'm familiar enough with the field of international law to attest that Ryan is one of the leading scholars currently working on public international law, especially human rights and law of war, as well as the field of national security law. Any quick summary, for example, of scholarship on whether and how international law works will include mention of his work with and his work with Derek Jinks, and his recent study on the boundaries of the power of states to kill or capture enemy combatants, which is forthcoming in the European Journal of International Law, is currently at the center of the debate on that topic, and I suspect that if folks have questions about things like drones and preventative detention in the Q&A, Ryan would be more than happy to talk about that. But beyond the work itself, Ryan is a rare character who commands the respect and affection of leading thinkers who agree on almost nothing else. Turning to a personal note, one of the most remarkable things about Ryan is his boundless energy to support colleagues and students. So when I arrived at the University of Chicago for a 2-year teaching fellowship, he had just finished his first year in that fellowship and became really my primary mentor there. And without his gentle and not so gentle prodding, I'm certain I would never have been able to get my first full-time job. I'm going to so turning to biography just a little bit, I'm going to embarrass him by telling a story he may not remember, which is, and to explain, the teaching fellows at the University of Chicago were like little specks in the shadow of very prominent academics, and so we didn't really register for the most part, but the Dean of Students received a letter, do you remember this? From an incoming first-year student who claimed that that student had chosen the University of Chicago Law School because he found out that Ryan Goodman was a teaching fellowship and taught the Introduction to Legal Research and Writing. And it was like 2 or 3 page letter, and this was based on Ryan's reputation as a debater in undergraduate at the University of Texas. And the letter explained in long detail the Ryan Goodman method of debating that had been famous for years after that this student had studied and mastered, and so he wanted to be assigned to Ryan's section in legal research and writing. And in the inimitable style of the University of Chicago, that was a surefire way not to be assigned to Ryan's section, and instead the student was by chance assigned to my section, and was very unhappy and was a drag to have to teach because he was not in Ryan's section and annoyed the whole term. But that actually was no surprise if you and I think you'll see what that reputation is based on. After the University of Texas and his debating prowess, Ryan studied law at Yale and received a PhD in sociology there as well, and then did a teaching fellowship at the University of Chicago and began teaching at Harvard, stayed there for a few years, and then moved to New York University School of Law, where he is the Anne and Joel Ehrenkranz Professor of Law, and is one of the founding contributors to justsecurity.org. I hope you're happy that I've plugged that, which is a blog dealing with international law and national security issues, which I recommend to you. As you're about to see, Ryan is a careful, dedicated, and impactful scholar. We're lucky to have dragged him down from New York to talk to us about his recent work, and with that, I give you Ryan Goodman.
So thanks very much to the Murphy Institute for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with you all. Also, Tulane is a little bit of my family's blood. My elder sister went to Tulane College, so in high school I grew up idealizing this campus and trying to visit it as many times as I could. and it's great to be back here. So I do want to maybe go off of, in a certain sense, the very kind introduction by Adam, and say that, in a sense, in my scholarship, I hadn't thought about introducing it this way, but in my scholarship, I kind of wear two hats. One hat is kind of as an interdisciplinary scholar, and for the main part of the opening lecture, that's what I want to present to you, basically the culmination of a book project that's an interdisciplinary analysis that tries to get at how you can change state behavior within human rights practices and human rights law. And then there's another hat that I wear as well, which is much more of a kind of a doctrinal law policy type. And when I focus on laws of war and U.S. national security issues, I'm usually wearing that hat. And that's the one I'd be happy to answer questions. And I'd also be happy to answer questions that might try to draw from what I talk about today in terms of interdisciplinary social science evidence of what changes state practice, and then think about how that might impact questions that are on the front page of newspapers about preventive detention, Guantanamo, drones, extrajudicial killings, and the like. Okay? But the main part of the opening that I want to present to you all, and then I'm looking forward to the Q&A, is about this book project that I've worked on in terms of the project itself over many years with a colleague and a friend of mine who actually was my debate partner at the University of Texas, Derek Jinks. And the idea is, in a certain sense, how to build a better mousetrap. How do you get states that would otherwise engage in highly illiberal, autocratic behavior to improve their human rights practices? And I'm framing it that way in part because that's a particular target of the scholarship and the research and the Normative Project are those types of states. But the project is studying all state behavior. And what I'll get to at the end of the talk are some of the normative implications that will suggest that when you try to target illiberal, highly autocratic, highly repressive state behavior, you can actually design international legal institutions to improve their practices, but there's a normative trade-off, because I think that the empirical evidence, if we follow our nose, will actually suggest you can get them to raise their standards, but the way in which you do that might mean that higher performing states are going to reduce their practices over time. So there's in some ways a race to the middle with respect to norms that are generated at the international level. You can bring certain states up, but at the same time you might be bringing other states down. So that's one of the hard normative questions that this kind of scholarship brings into focus. The idea behind the paper is to focus on the social forces or mechanisms by which one actor tries to change the behavior of another actor, generically speaking. So what the book does is it says you can identify three mechanisms of influence as to how you can change another actor's behavior. Material inducements, which I'll talk about in a bit and go down that column. Persuasion, and then what we say, Derek and I say, a third kind of missing that's been obscured by focusing on the other two, acculturation. And I'll explain in much greater detail what I mean by each of these three mechanisms. The book takes up this issue along two axes. The first axis is a substantive domain of human rights. In my earlier work and in my own practice in the area of human rights, I originally focused on civil and political rights. I worked in India and South Africa. I worked in LGBT rights in South Africa, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions in India. But the book also expands the domain into socio and economic rights as well. And that's in some ways my own maturation as a scholar, that I now think a lot about socio and economic rights, right to health, right to shelter, right to food. And the idea is to be both comprehensive, normatively speaking, and also to, as a kind of social scientific point, take up the hardest cases. In international human rights law and policy, socio and economic rights are thought to be the most difficult cases in which you're going to be least likely to achieve any real results, especially because all states are violators. How do you get any of them to really improve with respect to socio and economic rights? The most powerful states, like the United States, that otherwise might lead on certain issues, do not lead on social and economic rights. In fact, they're the laggards. So it's a kind of taking the hardest case and seeing whether or not we can actually use these mechanisms to influence state actors to improve human rights across the board. Civil and political rights, economic and social rights. That's the first axis, is just human rights as the domain. And then the second axis is a structural domain. in which what we focus on are international regimes. And by international regimes, what we mean to be is also very expansive. My earlier work simply focused on human rights treaties, how you design a treaty, if you'd let all states ratify the treaty or only states that perform according to a certain level, how would you codify with precision or not the obligations within the treaty. The book expands the regime beyond just treaties to intergovernmental organizations. So it also asks questions like, at the United Nations human rights, at the General Assembly, the primary organ for human rights is the Human Rights Council. Big question that was asked by Kofi Annan when he was the Secretary General of the UN is if they should reform that body to allow all states to join or place a litmus test that states had to already perform according to a certain level. So our project tries to get in on that kind of a question, and I'll suggest to you what the payoff might be afterwards when we walk through the mechanisms as to what the mechanisms would tell us about which would be a better policy solution, which would be more normatively attractive, kind of an all-comer universal membership organization or more restricted organization. And then when we think about the regime, what I'm also thinking about in terms of the international regime are not just intergovernmental organizations, but non-governmental organizations. So how should Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch design their human rights campaigns is a big question that we think these mechanisms would influence campaign strategy. And so it's broadly speaking, that's what we mean by the structure. And then another thing I just want to flag that I'll get into in greater detail is that we don't just look at membership within organizations, but also look at networks. And the idea here is that I would say there's a first generation of social science scholarship that asks the question, what happens when one state ratifies a treaty or joins an intergovernmental organization? What happens to its human rights practices? The new generation, I would say, of scholarship, social science scholarship, asks a different question, an additive question. Who are their peers when they join? And what social networks do those states form with other peer states? And what I think, and what I'm going to draw upon, are some kind of exciting social science research, at least it excites me, keeps me up late at night, that actually models states as you would model individuals in social networks. So in popular culture, we know a little bit about evidence that suggests that who you hang out with your friends or family, will determine how much weight you gain, how much food you eat. It also can determine who people vote for based on their associations. Not that who they vote for forms their associations, but their associations form their political preferences. And the idea is that there's actually social science evidence that models the state within its social network of other states and suggests that similarly, states are within a cultural environment and they take preferences of the other states with whom they form network ties. And I'll say a little bit about some of the surprising findings that research has produced and then what that would mean for us to think through these, answer some of these policy questions. So the first question that the way in which the book kind of goes into the literature is to say, in international legal scholarship, there's been an underspecification of these kinds of questions about mechanisms. That in international legal scholarship, the question is mainly being asked whether international law matters and whether international law makes a difference, but not how international law matters. And so international legal scholarship hasn't really asked the mechanism question. And the idea is that if we look to social science, that can start to foreground the mechanisms by which international legal scholars generally talk about ways in which human rights law and human rights actors like Amnesty International and the like can make a difference. Usually what they talk about are forms of coercion, which we translate as material inducement, or persuasion. But then what Derek Jinks and I thought about doing is saying, well, what do social psychologists actually mean when they say persuasion? What do the social psychology studies suggest actually persuades actors to change their preferences or understandings of their own identity? How do actors under what conditions respond to social pressure? So what do we actually mean by persuasion? And then what do we mean by a third or missing alternative, which is acculturation? And by acculturation, I'll just say for shorthand purposes, we mean things like emulation or mimicry of what is orthodox social practices. So the idea that these are three mechanisms that would actors' behavior, I think, is fairly obvious to many of us. But the thought that it would actually apply to states is not obvious. The idea that states act like individuals or exist in a global culture bumps up against very strong intuitions. And because of that, the thought is that behavioral logics like these three have been missing from the discussion. So what I thought would be useful is for me to actually walk down the columns by talking a bit about what I mean by basis of influence for material inducement, for persuasion, for acculturation. And by material inducement and basis of influence, what this idea or understanding is, you could sometimes associate it with Henry Kissinger, a view of the world that says that what determines outcomes is material power. And states act for their survival. And the state that has the most material power due to economic resources or military strength will determine the results in any kind of a conflict, essentially. But the thought is that if you don't have to characterize it as such, you could just say power is primarily dependent upon relationships of material resources and survival. The behavioral logic is instrumental. The way in which you change an actor's behavior is by changing their cost-benefit calculation. The form of influence is therefore material rewards and punishment. Sticks and carrots will change the price. And the end result is compliance, or another word for it might be capitulation. So in international law, you could think of two examples. So for carrots, I would say the Bush administration, the most recent Bush administration, created the Millennium Challenge account, which has millions of dollars in a pot of money that is given to states that can promise to and have the capacity to raise their standards with respect to, like, the rule of law or fair trials, if they can raise their standard millions of dollars from the U.S. government. That's a carrot approach. A stick approach might be like the U.S. government's recent withdrawal of aid from the Egyptian government, so economic sanctions. And the thought is that tools, and that's the toolkit that you would use to change state actors' behaviors by just changing the price of their engaging in a certain practice. Persuasion works very differently. The idea here is that you can change behavior by changing an actor's underlying preferences and interests. The conceptual touchstone of persuasion is about the content of the idea that you're trying to promote, or the content of the values that you're trying to promote. So the thought is that what the social psychology scholarship suggests is that if a particular issue is framed around a set of values that already resonates with the audience, or the actor that's the audience for the message, that's what will get that actor to change their beliefs or practices. And that the behavioral logic of the actor that's the subject of this message, of the campaign, is an active assessment of the validity of the rule and whether or not the validity of the rule is congruent with their existing value system. So the form of influence draws from social movement scholarship, and the techniques that they study are things like framing. And for example, in terms of social movements, one social movement is the anti-death penalty movement in the United States. The idea here is that the anti-death penalty movement was highly unsuccessful when it was framed as a human rights or humanitarian project about the dehumanization of capital punishment, but it succeeded when it was framed instead around an innocence project, the idea that innocent people are being executed in the United States. So that framing was successful because it's the latter that resonated with the U.S. domestic audience and public and political culture in the United States. At the international level, one of my favorite pieces of scholarship is by Richard Price. He studies the success of the anti-landmine movement. And he argues that the success of the anti-landmine movement was because it was first framed as an arms control agenda, didn't succeed. What it did succeed was as a humanitarian law agenda, and succeeded through making certain kinds of arguments that, if framed correctly, could change actors' beliefs because it resonated with their value system. So that he argues that arguments were made like landmines are more like, I think it's like 5 times more likely to kill a soldier after battle or an innocent civilian than ever kill or injure a soldier during battle. And those were the arguments that resonated, succeeded, and then you had a highly successful, almost universally ratified agreement to ban landmines. Another article by Thomas Ries from Germany just encapsulates this viewpoint in its title. The title of his piece, which is a kind of influential piece in the literature, is called "Let's Argue!" And the idea is that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International succeed because they persuade actors to change their beliefs. That might be the target country, so Indonesia under Suharto, or it might be that they're trying to change the IMF and its relationship to Suharto. But the thought is that it's through argumentation about the merit of the idea. So the thought is that instead of capitulation or compliance, it's acceptance. The actor actually changes their mind. So our argument is that at least in international legal scholarship, it's those two mechanisms that have taken front stage. And they've either overlooked or obscured a third mechanism. And what I mean by obscured is that you can find the third mechanism sometimes in the existing literature, but they call it persuasion. And the thought is that it actually operates on fundamentally different sets of logics, and therefore has to be separated. And otherwise, much of the literature will actually just talk about like hard power hard power material inducement and soft power persuasion, and just misses another form of influence. This form of influence, which we call acculturation, instead of the touchstone being the content of the norm or the validity of the idea, is the relationship to the group. So the idea is that individuals or actors will change their beliefs and practices based on their relationship to peers or their cultural environment. Instead of drawing from the literature on sociology of social movements, it draws from the sociology of organizations and sociological institutionalism, if you're familiar with that literature. The idea is that social expectations and cultural identity are what are key to actors changing their views, that actors will change their view if they think about their social role or their identity as a modern state. So at least prior to 9/11, the thought was modern states never torture. And their social status. There's a very good book by Ian Alistair Johnson in which he studies China, a kind of a hard case. And his argument is by empirically studying and surveying members of the Chinese Foreign Service, that the members of the Chinese Foreign Service thought of China's status in international affairs as being a responsible major power. And he kind of actually tracks the language of responsible major power, that identity shaped their negotiation stance in Vienna and elsewhere on arms control, that they made concessions in arms control that the members of the People's Liberation Army that were never meeting in Vienna didn't agree with. And the thought is that they were actually socialized in a certain sense, and it's because of their understanding of their status and identification with China as that kind of a global power, a responsible major power, that they conceded to international pressure. Really hard case, not only that it's China as a kind of another superpower, but that they would actually make concessions that are not, as according to their own PLA, People's Liberation Army experts, in the interest of the security of their own population. So just as an example of some of the evidence of that. The other form of the behavioral logic is mimicry. So this might be mimicry with respect to what it means to be a self-respecting state or a modern state. But it also might be mimicry with respect to whether or not you should run your economy by having a central independent bank. And actually there's some of the best empirical work, as far as I'm concerned, the most rigorous empirical work is actually on whether or not the diffusion of central independent banks around the world. What the scholarship does is find indicators for material inducement, for persuasion, and for what we call acculturation, but I think that scholarship called it mimesis. Or mimetic behavior, and they find that the diffusion of central independent banks around the world, that this was a very significant explanatory variable for it. Another study also studied the spread of state lottery systems around the world, the government setting up lotteries, thinking that that was the appropriate form of behavior of how you would best provide for the economy of the population. And they also track it according to the idea that this is an innovation that was diffused because it had become socially legitimated. So the idea for forms of influence are twofold. One is social rewards and punishment. You can think of these as shaming, shunning, and backpatting. And in fact, that's one of the areas in which, if you think about or look at the kind of existing commentary on human rights law and policy, there's conflation, because much of the existing literature will talk about Human Rights Watch. The way in which they succeed is by shaming bad actors into performing better. And our idea is that shaming is a form of is relying on social status and relationships to other groups. It's not relying on persuasion, even though they call that persuasion. So that's an example of the conflation that we think has to be separated out. And then broken apart from social rewards and punishment is the idea of cognitive costs and benefits. So this is the idea of an identity formation. In a way, this is kind of one of the weaknesses of our research. We do indeed look to the identity formation of children and undergraduates in experimental studies on college campuses, but the ways in which cognitive identity about how one should behave, how one behaves if one thinks of oneself as an adult in modern society. But then some of these studies are taken to the international level and think that states also have identities within international society. So that's the idea that that's a very different form of influence, of emulation and mimicry, cognitive identity formation, as opposed to social rewards and punishments. And when I've presented this table in a different form, in an earlier form, some people come back to me and say, shouldn't you have a fourth column? Like those two things are actually very different from one another. So the end result, instead of compliance and capitulation or acceptance, is what we say is just conformity, and it often results, though it's not necessary, but it often results in public conformity and private deviance. The very way in which actors often conform to social pressures and social environments by presenting, excuse me, by presenting themselves as consistent with social expectations, but there might be private deviance. They don't actually believe in that presentation. And for international human rights law, this might mean, if you look at the diffusion of fair trial rights provisions in constitutions around the world, almost all constitutions have it, including Saddam Hussein's Iraq. But do they actually practice it on the ground? No. So that's in some ways an empirical footprint that demonstrates a different form of influence and result of public conformity and private deviance. Though, as I've suggested, it's not a necessary effect, but it is an empirical evidence of the effect of what we call acculturation. So it doesn't have to only result in that kind of disjuncture, but that disjuncture is pretty strong evidence that that's what's going on. So the studies that we rely on, because I promised that I would talk to you a little bit about the empirical research that's been done to study this effect. Some of the studies are qualitative studies, and I can get into some of those. For example, there's a very good study on why it took Britain so long to ratify the Genocide Convention. And that's a kind of a qualitative case study that goes into the archives and demonstrates that Britain really was concerned about its social status or standing in the international community, thinking of itself as being there, especially if the USSR was going to ratify this thing before them. And it were those kinds of pressures and thoughts about honor for the nation in terms of vis-a-vis the international community that really pushed Britain into the position that otherwise other ministries within the government were pushing against. So that's the idea of the kind of relationship to group that we think is an important kind of finding. But the research that we draw on more heavily, admittedly, in the book, and that I think is also highly interesting, is the statistical research. These are like large-end studies that try to take account of all countries in the world in which there is available data, often over 100-year periods, a 100-year period. And what they find are what we talk about as, Derek and I talk about as paired findings. Homogenization in structure and public positions by governments. So the technical term that's used in some of this literature is isomorphism, but homogenization is a good enough synonym for it. But decoupling, so that it actually is public conformity, but it's decoupled from local practices. And so examples of this are that there's a great study on domestic violence in the inter-American system, and it shows a spread of a standardized model of domestic violence throughout the Americas that follows regional time in terms of a quick change over time within the region, and doesn't follow national time, so that the indicators, the strongest indicators for change are, for example, whether or not a state's regional partners or neighbors adopt a particular form of domestic violence statutes is a very strong predictor as to whether or not that state will adopt the similar kind of domestic violence statute, and that these are kinds of cascade effects. What the evidence also suggests is it does not track is what I'd call national time or local time. It does not track local social movements. So in fact, you find states adopting domestic violence statutes with no or negligible women's rights movements within the country. And as I mentioned, the researcher is drawing from the social movements research that would otherwise think that bottom-up change, that you would have to have women's rights movements within a country in order to get domestic violence statutes on the books and domestic violence agencies within ministries. But in fact, it finds that that's not a necessary condition and is not a strong indicator. It doesn't have strong explanatory power. And that's apart what we mean by decoupling. That at some level, decoupling might also mean that you get widespread homogenization with respect to a particular norm or innovation, but it's decoupled from local, cultural, material, or historical conditions. So it's decoupled from social movements within the country and the like. Another example is environmental law and policy. So there's some of the best work has been done by a scholar by the name of David John Frank. I can always remember it because there are very few names like that. David John Frank et al. And they show how different forms of environmental policy have diffused around the world, like national parks, environmental impact statements, environmental ministries, and they demonstrate that that has also followed world time with a kind of a world cascade effect in which it appears to be that states are following what their peers are doing, and it does not follow local time, national time or national indicators. That it is not a strong indicator for that is international pressure, but not environmental degradation, industrialization. And that would be your expectation. So the intuition would be states will adopt these kinds of environmental policies if in fact they're going through industrialization or they have an environmental problem. And in fact, what the way in which the authors describe it is a form of solutions chasing problems. States adopt solutions even though they don't have the problem. Other examples include a kind of a funny study on arms races, that states will buy supersonic aircraft that even though they don't face a regional security threat, but it's enough supersonic aircraft, literally speaking, to put on a good air show, right? Other examples, and other examples abound. One example that's usually given, it's an anecdotal example, but by the scholar Martha Finnemore, is states adopting like tripartite militaries, including navies, even though they're landlocked. Okay, or every state thinking that they must have not every, but a lot of states thinking that they should have a national airline, even though it would make much more economic sense for them to outsource that, let's say. So the thought is that those are the kinds of indicators that we have of the isomorphism or homogenization and the spread of international norms because states want to mimic or emulate orthodox practices. The other sets of studies, so that's what I also somewhat think of as first generation studies. Even though they are somewhat on the cutting edge, they're on the front, not the front pages, but they're in the pages of the leading social science journals these days. But I think that there's an additional set of studies that's important, and I just want to say a few words about them now. Which I think is the next wave. There are about, I would say, half a dozen studies at this point, and I think it's the way of the future, which are social network analyses of states. And these studies take states themselves as the actor, and they demonstrate ways in which when states share membership with other states in intergovernmental organizations, they are more likely to converge in their practices. So some of the studies, just to give you examples of them, one study is on the environment. And it shows that when states become more centrally located within a social network, that they have more nodes connecting to them, they're more likely to adopt a particular form of representation in negotiations on environmental treaties. And that form is to allow civil society actors in. And the researchers think that this is a cultural explanation, more like emulation, that the idea is that that is what a legitimate, powerful state does, is it brings in civil society, even though it doesn't suit their material interests to do so, and it's not congruent with their existing value structure. But the idea is that the placement within the network might come with certain kinds of social expectations. Other studies, one of my favorite scholars, and I have many, but one of my favorite scholars is Brian Greenhill, a political scientist, assistant professor up at Dartmouth. He studies when states share memberships within intergovernmental organizations with other states, what is the average practice of human rights performance with the other states? within those organizations. Because if acculturation is correct, we shouldn't just think about how many linkages a state has to intergovernmental organizations, but actually who's there when you get there. Who's kind of like who's at the party if you're going to be socialized at the party. And he finds that there's a convergence towards the mean by states, that they start to take on the practices and performance levels of the other states within the average set of performance or practice levels of other states within their overlapping intergovernmental organization memberships. And that's not exactly a rosy picture for human rights. It might mean in some contexts that states that are low-performing states enter into these social environments and then start to perform better, but it's a two-way street in that other states that are high-performing start to gravitate towards the mean as well. And other studies, just because this might also interest people in other areas outside of human rights, there's a scholar by the name of Shun Chow who studies convergence within capital taxation rates. And he finds that states that join human rights treaties that have nothing to do with capital taxation rates actually converge in their capital taxation rates. He does other studies that look at monetary and finance policy and finds convergence by states that share overlapping membership in trade organizations that have nothing to do with the regulation of monetary and fiscal policy, of those particular monetary and fiscal policies. And then there's another study by two scholars, Torfason and Ingram, in which they looked at the ways in which states that share overlapping memberships with other states start to trend towards their peers' levels of democratization. And that defied their expectations as scholars. They thought that democracies were going to influence autocratic states in the direction of democratization, but they found, again, it was a two-way street, that the social network and the being embedded within a social network also meant that democratic states started to become less democratic over time, depending upon what networks they were forming with other states. So that's kind of the three mechanisms. That's some of the social science evidence. And then let me say a little bit about what I think is the policy payoff for some of these questions. So some of the questions, a big policy payoff is the very question that I kind of highlighted at the beginning, membership. There's a big debate in policy circles and legal circles, for example, about whether or not you should allow all states to join certain treaties or certain organizations. One of the leading books that's been written, it's probably, I think it's fair to say maybe the best book that's been written on human rights in the last 10 years is by Beth Simmons. She won both the generic Political Science Award of the Year and the International Law Scholarship Best Book of the Year. She does an empirical study just asking the question of, does ratification of human rights treaties improve human rights practices? And at the end of the day, she finds that it does for certain sets of states, states that are transitional, kind of transitioning in and out of democracy or liberal versus illiberal status conditions. And then she says, but for the other states, the ones that are high performers and the ones that are extraordinarily low performers, forget about it. Don't waste resources trying to get those states to ratify because it doesn't have an effect. Emily Hafner-Burton now has a book out this year in which she argues in favor of triage, where she says it shouldn't just be applied to ratification of treaties. The way in which the international community dedicates its resources should shift away from states that are highly illiberal and beyond influence and towards other states, because think of the enormous opportunity costs if you're spending all your resources focusing on states, or a lot of resources focusing on states where it's not going to make a difference. So Derek and my argument is that acculturation would suggest universal membership is actually a very powerful way for influencing state behavior. For example, just to take something out of the headlines, the headlines I read, I suppose, over the last week, there's a big debate about the fact, or big brouhaha, about the fact that certain states were admitted into the Human Rights Council, so the flagship organization of the UN that deals with human rights, including Saudi Arabia and China. This argument would say, actually, that's a great place to have them because they're more likely to take on the norms of the other states that are there. and the expectations of a kind of an organization like that. And it would probably be even better if it was one of universal membership, so that it didn't exclude other states. That was not actually those are not my personal priors before I entered this project. My priors were I was born in South Africa. I advocated for the sanctioning of South African sanctions. I advocated for the sanctioning of Burma when I worked on that as a law student. So I thought exclusion was a better form. Now I'm much more cautious about that. I think universal membership and maybe exclusion, but then exclusion first requires the actor wanting to be a part of the international community. So first you have to buy them into that kind of community in which banishment might then work as a kind of a lever. So the kind of social shaming, social punishment. Other implications for the scholarship, from the scholarship, are questions like precision. So the idea here is that the conventional wisdom in international relations, political science, and in international law is that the more precise you can make an international human rights rule, the better. If you're dealing with material inducement, it creates sharp focal points around which you can judge compliance and violations. For persuasion, the leading book is by Tony and Abe Chase, in which they say the leading reason why states don't comply with their international agreements is because of lack of precision. And theirs is a persuasion-based model. Our model suggests actually abstract models that are not even codified sometimes can gain the greatest traction around the world. The last bit that I thought I'd end with, especially because of what I think of as you all self-selecting into being in this room, are some of the normative questions. And some of the normative questions are the ones that I've already kind of flagged throughout this. Are some of the issues that I'm trying to grapple with myself, and that is the race to the middle and the two-way street. One of the issues of the race to the middle, an area in which I've worked on in practice, I haven't really studied it as much in my scholarship, are national human rights commissions. So the United Nations went around the world essentially with a particular norm entrepreneur that everybody who works in this area knows his name, and said to states around the world, you should adopt a National Human Rights Commission, regardless of your domestic, political, institutional conditions, regardless of the strength or independence of existing courts. So National Human Rights Commissions have spread around the world. And generally, in my practice, I've actually thought of that as being net beneficially good, a good thing. But the research here in the book makes me think that what's actually happened with the National Human Rights Commissions is a race to the middle. That there's become a standardized, almost cookie-cutter version of what a National Human Rights Commission should look like, and therefore it doesn't necessarily suit the functional demands of a state or the normative priorities of a state, and states that would have adopted a stronger version of a National Human Rights Commission, let's say, will actually adopt instead the standardized global model. There's even a term that's given, or a document that is used as the template, the Paris Principles. And if your commission is Paris Principles compliant, then you've obtained international legitimacy for your institution. And the argument here is that domestic movements would push for greater forms of accountability mechanisms, but the state is satisfied when it can tick off that it's met the international standard. So that's part of the kind of negative effects of this. And then the other one is the race to the middle more generally. The two-way street more generally. So the idea here is that I do actually think there is a trade-off. That if our target is if our target are the most illiberal states or repressive state practices, the story here is optimistic in that it says that there are ways in which these actors can be influenced through social networks, through cognitive and social pressures, but that has a two-way influence. As I've suggested, that it also might mean that higher performing states are going to drop down in their standards. I think I should leave it at that. I'll say one more element just before opening it up, and that is that in some sense I have a kind of a dispassionate view of the evidence, and part of what we're trying to do is simply identify the conditions under which states change their behavior within the policy arena of human rights. And some of the studies that we look at are not just positive human rights developments, like I've suggested. Maybe you'd think all of them are positive: anti-landmines, fair trial rights, national human rights commissions. But some of the studies are also of things like eugenics in the interwar period. So there's a very good study that suggests that genocidal conceptions were legitimated, and states adopted eugenics-based policies according to an acculturation form of influence around the world. So the thought is that this really does try to take a dispassionate step back, think about what the levers are, and if we understand the levers, then they can be utilized to promote better normative outcomes. Thanks.